I'm reading from my book, It's Not a Boy, and I'm reading the final part of my chapter about glades. We'd had to enter a painting competition called Glades, and when I found out what glades were, then I painted Mr. Lordley's woodland. It was a place I used to go when I wasn't really allowed to, because he prosecuted trespassers and he had a gun. But I'd gone just the same, and I'd painted his scene for the competition. We got all dressed up and went to the garden party. Mam was in her best costume with her matching shoes and handbag. And she said that if Mr. Lordley spoke to us, we had to say sir. Dad didn't go, of course. He had too much to do looking after his animals. There was a big tent on the lawn and trestles with white cloths and little cakes and little cups of tea filled from big teapots. Mr. Lordley was standing at the door of his manor. He had his hands behind his back. And do you know, he was a very little man. And he was very old, and he had a bald head. I don't know how ever I could have thought he was frightening. He didn't look frightening at all. And I couldn't help but notice that it seemed to be on his own all the time. The only people that spoke to him were the hired caterers in their little black and white outfits. After our tea and cakes, we went into the tent and looked for my painting. There were jam pots and sponge cakes and flowers. So many people had sent entries for Mr. Lordley to judge. We couldn't find my painting for ages because there were so many people who had entered. And then at last we saw it, and we were so excited because it said first prize. There was a comment underneath as well, and it said, "This is a very realistic painting." Well, of course, it would be a very realistic painting because I'd finished Mr. Lordley's scene and painted what I saw in his woodland. But I didn't tell anyone at all, just in case of consequences and just in case you weren't supposed to do that. So, of course, my mam was very proud of me. She pulled her stomach in and pushed her shoulders back and held her head high and smiled her beautiful smile at everybody. Then Mr. Lordley came to present the prizes, and he gave me a big certificate with the Gazette Painting Competition First Prize written on it in big red letters. And then I had a big tin of sweets with the compliments of the Gazette. And if that was not enough, Mr. Lordley came and ruffled my hair and gave me half a crown out of his own pocket. Well, I was so taken aback that I forgot to say thank you. Never mind, sir. I had never had so many sweets or so much money in one go. So I felt very lucky indeed. Suddenly, I also felt as tall as the tallest trees in the wood, and I felt as if I could do anything. I'd won first prize for my painting. I had a bag of sweets and I had some money, and my mam was pleased with me. In fact, I felt so good that I went round giving all the kids a sweet, and I gave Doreen too, and she laughed out loud. I was so happy. And it was a funny thing, but after that, I felt I could do better at school. Even if I was poorly, I did spellings in bed. And then I started to get better. And then I got better marks. I didn't get 10 out of 10, mind you, but I'd got naught originally, so I had a long way to go. but I did get better. I couldn't put sums and spellings on my what I am good at list yet, but I didn't mind too much because I could definitely put good at painting on the list. And another good thing was that I started not to mind spellings and sums. I didn't mind them in my head, buzzing away there nicely with the birds and the bees and glades, of course. And then I realised I was not even scared of Mr. Lordley, because he was such a little old man. So that was another happy thing for me. But the next thing we knew was not so happy, because Mr. Lordley dropped dead. Mr. Lordley had died. Uncle Sid read it in the Gazette that he had crossed over. He had been dead 2 days before he was found, and then it was only by its housekeeper when she got back after her weekend off. So the big boys didn't look after him in the end. There was a very big funeral. Everybody came to pay their respects to the important Mr. Gerald Lordley, Esquire, and some people even came from down south. I thought it was very surprising that he had so many friends now that he died, but there was nobody there to see if he was all right that weekend when he was crossing over. Anyway, Gum Church was packed out, and some people were even standing outside. Uncle Sid went, of course, but my dad didn't. Then, after all the fuss of the funeral, the estate had to be cleared, and us kids crept again along that mossy track. I suppose that as Mr. Lordley was dead, we could go without hiding and just walked up in clear sight, but you never knew what the consequences would be if we were found, so we did hide. All the workers were cutting the undergrowth near the big house. It was a real mess. The house was practically in ruins inside, so they said, and the garden was covered with tall grasses and overhanging trees. They lit big bonfires to get rid of all that rubbish, and as we watched, we could see the smoke climbing in the sky. Then all at once a wind got up from nowhere, and we saw flames bend and turn sideways. A great big red flash reared up to the old coach shed, and we heard a bang. We were so scared then, even though we knew it couldn't be Mr. Lordley with his gun, we ran off home. And then we heard the fire engine bell. And we thought, that's it. It's all over. But a few days later, I found out that it wasn't quite over as I'd thought. You see, the village bobby from Ringham came riding down our lane on his bike. He saw us kids and came over to us. He wanted to know if we'd ever been up that mossy track in the woods. And of course we all just stood there and didn't dare say anything. I was thinking about trespassing and about consequences. I started to think I'd better not say a thing. But my mouth went dry and I went very red as well. The bobby saw me, of course, and he took me aside away from the other children. "Can you remember things in your head?" he asked, bending down to look in my eyes. I nodded, too frightened to speak. My face went redder and my mouth went drier. That was it then. They'd come to take me to Hull Assizes like Bill Lowe. I didn't know how they'd found out that I'd stolen Mr. Lordley's garden scene and kept it in my head and used it in my painting competition, but somehow they had, and I would have to face the consequences and pay. I would have to give up that half-crown and my first prize certificate. The bobby from Ringham could take me away straight away to prison, and he could shout the bad news like Posty as he pedalled on his way. He could even take me on his crossbar, shouting, "She's arrested! She's guilty for stealing that scene!" But he didn't do that. Instead, he kept looking into my eyes. "Did you see what was inside that shed?" I nodded. He had found a second crime, and I was going to have to pay for looking in that shed as well. I would be paying all my life, now that I'd been found out, and there was no point in lying. I admitted everything, there and then, and told him all about my painting and all about the lovely carriage with the red velvet seats and the brass carriage lamps. Funnily enough, though, he didn't bother at all about my painting and the way I'd stolen that scene. He was just interested in the carriage that had been burnt. He said that he was pleased with me because they needed to know for insurance purposes what was inside, and I'd been very helpful. So that really was the end of that. And the bobby just said, "Now run along and play." And I did. And I didn't have to pay. And there were no sad consequences for me this time.